Hi, I'm Anjali Alappat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 3, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. This week, I chat with another seminal Indian sci-fi author, Vandana Singh. A professor of physics, Vandana's work combines science with social issues and climate concerns in fascinating ways. Her short stories capture the micro and macro of the ever-evolving climate crisis, in our world and in others. Join us as we discuss the urgency of climate change, the moral ambiguity of technology and the greater good, the necessity of acknowledging privilege, and death cults. Hi, Vandana. Welcome to Arcx. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's entirely my pleasure.
So I kind of want to start things off strong, and this is my favorite question to ask everybody who comes on the show. Could you tell us a bit about your journey as a writer? Did you always want to be one?
Well, I don't think I thought consciously about being a writer, although I wrote a lot, including my earliest memory is writing something in imitation of an Enid Blyton story when I was about 5 years old. So I would keep writing through the ages, through the years, until there came a point when I thought of writing seriously, like not just for myself, but for the world, hopefully. And that happened when, after a PhD in physics and a postdoctoral fellowship, I found myself without a job and raising joyfully a daughter at home and needing intellectual stimulation and also having a lot to think about science, about society, about the universe, about the troubles of the world. So that's when I started to write and write speculative fiction, science fiction. And that was the first time, and I was in my early 30s, so a long time ago, the first time that I thought about writing not just for myself, but for the world.
That's wonderful. And it's always so interesting when people come to writing professionally a little later after they've studied and worked and things like that. You did mention Enid Blyton. So was she an influence of yours when you first started, reading and learning about stories?
She was one of the major early influences. Also an influence in the early years were these little books in Hindi. They were these little pocket books that were fantastic stories of fairies and adventures and all kinds of strange lands and things like that. And I remember being utterly struck by them. Later, I read the usual science fiction, Western science fiction stalwarts like Asimov and Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke. But actually, after a while, I started to feel betrayed by some of them, and particularly by Enid Blyton, because as I grew older into my late teens and early 20s, I realized that I was not the intended audience of many of these writers, especially Enid Blyton. And, I started to recognize some of the racism in the stories and so on. I got a little, let's say, disenchanted with science fiction because I couldn't see myself in any of those imagined futures. And yet, there was something about the experience of going abroad for a PhD and being in an alien land that made science fiction feel particularly relevant. And that was in my early 20s when I came back to science fiction and decided that, what the hell, I'm going to write it. And I'm going to write it, centrally for people like me, although I hope the world will read it. And of course, at that time, I had ambition, but I had no expectation that anyone would even want to publish my work. What changed for me actually was that my brother had been saying for years, read Ursula Le Guin. And so I finally, in my early 30s, sat down and read her novel, The Dispossessed. And it blew me away. It was like the universe had just burst open and told me that science fiction was my country too, that people like me actually had a place in it, that it was not just for, white boys with toys. And it was not just about Martians and ray guns. There was much more to it. There was much more nuance. There was philosophy. There were issues of justice. It's not just about technological futures, but also about sociological futures. That was revelatory. And that is, I think, what really encouraged my writing.
I identify so strongly with this because I think I had a similar journey with science fiction. I came to it later. I came to it in college and it felt very inaccessible to me for the most part. And until I read The Left Hand of Darkness. And I remember thinking, now I understand. Now I get it. And it is beautiful also now to kind of see the new writers coming in and writing things which feel very accessible now. And it just feels like a different world, which is so encouraging.
Yeah, it really is a different world. Yeah, thankfully.
Thankfully. But also, I mean, you did mention Enid Blyton and not being the audience for it. And I think that's an experience that a lot of Indian kids in particular would have in common with you, because it was a greatly bizarre thing to me to realize that she was not half as important to English school children as she was to us. And so many of us, I think, were very formed by her early fairy tales. And yes, I completely identify with suddenly the slow dawning realization of racism. I mean, of course, there were things that you didn't particularly like or you didn't see yourself in. But what was it about those stories which kind of captured your imagination? Because you did stick with sci-fi at the end of it.
Yeah. I think I read Asimov pretty early on and was immediately enchanted by the possibilities, of space exploration, of technological marvels, and of adventure. And Asimov is very good with ideas, but he is not a stylist. However, you have to read people who are not particularly good writers in order to appreciate the really good writers. So, later on, after Asimov, I read Ray Bradbury and I read Fahrenheit 451. And, that's a literary work, the use of language, the sociological imagination there. And I thought, wow, this is science fiction. That's pretty cool. I read a lot of Arthur C. Clarke as well. And well, before that, there were these really terrible books. I'm trying to remember what they were. They were adventure stories in space. Tom Swift, I think. And they were really terrible, but I just lapped up the adventure. That's the exciting part of things. The prospect that there were unknown places to discover that may have strange creatures in them and all of that. And, as a child, you are exploring the world. And, I was always in sympathy with the creatures because I was very shy as a kid. So I could relate best to the street dogs and the birds and the squirrels and so on and so forth. So it seemed to kind of parallel the fascination that the world held for me. And yet at the same time, as I grew older, I started to realize it wasn't just the subtle racism or it was also erasure, that people like me didn't exist in the stories and didn't exist in the futures. So it was like, okay, do adventures only happen to blonde, blue-eyed people or what? It was very weird. And therefore, I kind of became disenchanted, as I said. And even though I loved the adventure of it and the wonder of the possibilities of space exploration and so on and so forth. And later on, I came to critique that the way it's done, like, for instance, the current space race, which is led by techno-billionaires and is, I think, one of the most dangerous things that is happening to our world today. But anyway, so at that time, those things were fascinating. And I particularly remember, when we were kids and we used to visit my grandparents in Patna, we used to sometimes be allowed to sleep on cots on the rooftop. And I still remember in those great days before pollution, you could look at the sky and it would be thick with stars. And it was almost like you'd get vertigo looking up at the stars and you'd feel like you'd be falling into them. And I used to wonder, I wonder if there are creatures on other worlds looking back at me, So that feeling for science fiction came pretty early. And in my mid to late teens, I think, I started to get really disenchanted. And it wasn't until my mid-20s or so, when I was a stranger in a strange land, that I came back to science fiction.
Well, I think we can all say that we're very grateful that you kind of came back to it.
Well, thank you for that. I am too.
And before we kind of get into a deeper discussion of your work, I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed your past work, because both Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet and Ambiguity Machines actually left a big impression on me. And I'm really delighted that I get to discuss this with you. And what we're going to be discussing are your most recent works, which are two short stories, Three World Cantata and Mina's Dream, and a novella, which is Traveler's Tales from the End of the World. So to kick things off, could you tell us a bit about your world building process? Like, these stories, which we've kind of selected to talk about, are all set in very different backgrounds. And, one is in a sort of mental changing landscape. One features a very distinctive kind of time travel through space and time, I would say. And one is set in a very recognizable suburban situation. So why do you choose the settings that you do?
Let me say thank you for reading my stories. Writing is a pretty lonely job, and one never knows whether, one's words have struck a chord in somebody's heart. So thank you for that. And yeah, world building is something that actually I love to do. And particularly, the stories you've mentioned, my three most recent works, two of them, Three World Cantata and Nina's Dream, are part of Climate Imagination Fellowship from the Center for Science and Imagination at Arizona State University, and freely available on the internet. But also the third story, Traveler's Tales from the Ends of the World, they are stories about global social environmental crises, with climate change being the major part of it, the major driver and accelerator of other crises as well. And one of the things that I have been thinking about, particularly for climate fiction, is that the climate problem is both local and planet-wide, right? It's both local and global. It manifests differently in different places around the globe. And so what I realized when I started to write this stuff, and I think my first climate story was probably around 2014, it was called Entanglement, is that if you want to mirror the climate problem's key features, then you can't set the story in one place necessarily. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it if you do that, but I was trying to experiment with structure. So what if you have a story that has sub-stories that are set in different geographies and landscapes, and then you have something that, a thread or two, that connects these stories together. And hence the structure of some of the stories, like, both Three World Cantata and Traveler's Tales from the Ends of the World are novellas. They do jump from place to place. Three World Cantata has a kind of, as you mentioned, a kind of mental world, which is a simulation. And it also has, it's interwoven with realistic snapshots as well. And it really is about three worlds. World zero, which is our world, and world one, which is a certain imagined future. And just to give away what that's about, it's a future as imagined by techno billionaires. And world two is an experiment, again, an experimental imagined future, which is more complicated, more messy, but also more just and more equitable. So, I had to reflect the different locations and the different cultures of the people in those locations. And that meant doing world building. I usually have the impetus to write something when it's not just ideas, because I always have ideas in my head, but when a character walks into my head and says, "This is me, write my story." And I don't know what that story is until I marry it with the landscape, because the landscape is very much a character. And then I have to understand who the character is, what's their relationship to the landscape. And that's where the world building comes in, and also the sociological world building. What's the character's background? What's their belief system? How do they interact with other people? Do they have a family? What's their definition of family in this world? And so on. So I think that it's once I get the impetus for the story and I have this vivid image of the character in that landscape with other people or other creatures and so on, that's when I start to write it. And then the research state comes in, that I have to research, how is this going to actually work? And that itself is fascinating too. And then it gradually comes together. And it's a mysterious process. And it doesn't necessarily work the same way in every story, I have to say.
I am very fascinated with how you link sociological and ecological disaster. Because, I mean, I do feel in these three stories, we're talking about the climate from perhaps different perspectives. But at the same time, it's all linked together with people and their actions, really. And I think in Three Ball Cantata, the protagonist, if we can call him that, I guess anti-hero feels more. I think he's actually the villain, but who knows? He's kind of being mentally manipulated for the greater good. And it is an ethical gray zone. I mean, not so much gray zone, it's pretty bad, but at the same time, everybody is doing it for the greater good. But how did that idea come to you, and why frame it through the eyes of the anti hero? Because he's a pretty terrible guy.
Manny, as he likes to be called, is a new and emerging Indian billionaire. His name is Manas, actually, but he goes by Manny. And even though his origins were very, very, very humble, he's bought into the whole, like techno billionaire kind of thing. So it's interesting, actually, that question you asked, why I started with the anti-hero in a way. I did try to make him human because there's that backstory about his early life that he discovers that kind of shakes him up, and who knows, perhaps it changes him in some way. But at any rate, the reason this came about is that I happened to attend a conference, which was essentially, in many ways, a conference of the elite talking about climate change. And the speakers there were, top-notch, like international leaders, CEOs, those sort of people. And I had such a huge sense of a vast gap or abyss between how they conceptualized the world and how I was slowly learning to reconceptualize it. Because I should say straight out that, I come from a relatively privileged background as a middle-class Indian expat and, who has a lot of intellectual privilege, for instance, and also upper caste privilege, although my family in many ways is anti-caste and my parents had a mixed caste marriage, but nevertheless, upper caste. And so I've had to kind of try to reconceptualize or relearn, unlearn some things and relearn other things. I owe a huge debt to the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States for helping me recognize what structural privilege is, which blinds you to how the worlds in which other people less privileged actually survive, and to connect that to caste privilege and other kinds of privilege. So I should say that, first off. I owe a huge debt not just to the Black Lives Matter movement, but also to Adivasi writers, Adivasi thinkers, indigenous thinkers all around the world. I'm really learning and continuing to learn about how they construct worlds and why our construction of the world, when I say our, I mean the globalized, mainstream, industrialized construction of the world, call it a paradigm or worldview or whatever, is so incredibly harmful. It's literally a kind of death cult, because look at where we are now. In 150 years since the Industrial Revolution, we're at the brink of global disaster, where human civilization, if we continue on this course, it's not going to survive. In that conference, I was really struck by this enormous gap and that kind of delusion that the super rich and the super powerful have about the amount of power they wield and their devotion to the status quo. They do not want to change the system. Most of the talks by the super powerful people in that room were about how we must preserve the system, the socio-economic system that runs the world, even though that's the thing that's destroying the globe. So I thought, okay, this is utterly fascinating. I'd also read about billionaires, constructing luxury climate bunkers for when the world comes to an end or whatever, when things collapse, including having armed guards to kill off the unwashed public if they rise against them, that sort of thing. So all this was really infuriating, but it was also fascinating. Like, how can human beings think so differently, And so I started to really try to explore how the various kinds of delusions, occur in the minds of people who are billionaires, who have so much wealth and power that they think they can do anything and they think they're insulated from everything, including the consequences of their action. And that's how Manny came to be. I wanted to contrast, and that's why it's called Three World Cantata. It's really about three worlds. And so world one is the world that is imagined by the techno billionaires. And I wanted to contrast that with world two, which is, like I said, messy and not without problems, but much more equitable, where ordinary people, so-called ordinary people, actually have a say in the shaping of the future and of their worlds.
Thank you for answering so honestly. And thank you for acknowledging that privilege, because I think it's an incredibly touchy topic in India still, where there's a lot of hesitance around having conversations about caste and class, and a lot of denial of privilege as well, which I think is something that we all have to come to terms with, however uncomfortable it is to move forward as a society. And what you say about that gap between the very rich and even middle class, it's widening all the time. And as you said, the status quo is serving a very different set of people. I was also very interested in world two, because as you said, it's messy. And of course, there are a lot of things there that probably don't work as well as they could, but at the same time, it's a work in progress, I would say. And I really enjoyed the concept of the pause. I mean, could you tell me a bit about that? What were you thinking when you put that down?
I was in Delhi for actually 6 months during the pandemic. And it was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Wonderful because the skies cleared up, the roads were clean, the birds came back. And, I heard all kinds of stories from friends in places like Chandigarh and all that. Oh, there's a herd of deer crossing the road right now, or wild elephants have come down from the forests. It was as though a window had appeared between two possible worlds. And, so the idea of a deliberate pause, which is paid for, it has to actually begin with accountability and with the power to bring down and sue and take away the profits of the large corporations. So in world two, that's a work in progress, of course, but it has been accomplished through international courts and so on and so forth, pushed by youth movements, indigenous movements, ordinary people's movements. The large corporations have been brought down and they have to turn their assets to the public good. And so the idea of the pause arises from this, because if you can then pay people to do ecological restoration and social restoration, during a great pause. So let's say, these are deliberate pauses, not inadvertent pauses like during COVID, where all non-essential commercial activities stops, schools stop, and you have something like 3 months or 2 months or whatever. And then people come together in their communities, in their symbiomes, or if they don't have symbiomes, at least in their cities and neighborhoods, and they do the work of restoration. There's the scene where Manny is on a beach where the local people are restoring mangroves. And that actually is taken from reality. You may have come across, I don't know if enough people know about this, but the Vikalp Sangam project, if you look at this, literally the confluence of alternatives. So there are people who have been recording and networking hundreds of local grassroots movements and experiments, mostly by marginalized communities all over India. And among them are efforts like this one. I have a friend, an activist who works with people in the Sundarbans. And just a couple of years ago, they planted 2 million mangrove seedlings along the shore. Because we know what mangroves do, not only are they great at pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, but they stabilize the shoreline, they prevent the extremes of, cyclones and so on and so forth. And of course, they maintain biodiversity. So along with climate, the other great crisis we are in is mass extinction of species, the sixth one in the Earth's history. And this one caused by what I guess you can say human activity, but it really is the socioeconomic structure that has been built by the powerful that is causing it. Probably a more accurate term would be modern industrial civilization. So the idea of the pause had all these origins. The point is not whether it's feasible or not. We don't know what the future holds. But the point is to expand our imaginations. When you expand your imagination, when you have a certain elasticity of the imagination, you're better prepared for what the present and the future are throwing at you.
Moving along to my absolute favorite of the stories that you've written recently is, Traveler's Tales from the End of the World. First off, this was just absolutely lovely. There's just a stunning sense of synchronicity to the story that I really appreciated. Though, of course, it's very deliberate on your part, this circle that you formed through your storytelling. Could you tell us about why you highlighted these particular characters? They're very different. King, Queen, Tiger, spelt with a Y. Their origins are so vastly different. And also, I wanted to ask, were you doing a nod to William Blake?
This is one of the stories that, happened in this weird patchwork way that actually often happens with me. I maintain a file in my computer where I just write down paragraphs that occur to me that, are fragments of possible stories. Story seeds is what I call them. The first part of Traveler's Tales from the Ends of the World, which is about a man running, was a separate little piece that I wrote. And then the one that comes much later about a woman and her baby in the Sundarbans trying to escape from a murderer, that was also a separate little thing because, I'd been reading a lot about the Sundarbans and I was in touch with two of my friends who work with communities there. And it was, informing my imagination. They weren't written in their full form the way they are in the novella. They were like, a couple of paragraphs and so on. And so sometimes what happens is that when a character starts to speak to you in your head and you feel like you have to write a story, then, it comes to me, all these threads start to come together. And it's very unexpected. Now, of course, there's no one good way to write necessarily, and different things work for different people. But for me, I write to discover what's going to happen next because I don't necessarily know it. I just have these glimpses and vague notions and so on. So there were a few things that impelled me to write this story. One was just seeing that there was a sort of communication between all these disparate little paragraphs of story seeds that seemed to be talking to each other. And the other was that I wanted to break this barrier between the storyteller and the listener or the reader. As you know, in India, in South Asia, in many parts of the world, we've had long traditions of oral storytelling. And I wanted to have the audience, or whatever you call it, come into the story. And I thought, I really want somebody to tell this story and invite the audience into it. And so the storyteller came to be. And in fact, this story begins with the storyteller inviting anyone, literally inviting the listener to come into the fabric of the story. And hence the metaphor of the loom. She's actually working a loom from which, a tapestry unfolds. And the threads in the tapestry are threads of stories. And so she herself doesn't know what's going to come up next. So I actually read out a very kind of half-finished version of this story at a science fiction convention in the US, which was online. As an experiment, I requested everyone to turn on their videos and so that the audience was really there and really present. And I was stunned at the reception. People just loved that. And I realized what we are missing by, having reading be such a solitary act. The stories reverberate in your bones. That was a large part of the impetus. And then it basically was all about stitching the pieces together and then creating new little stories where they were needed.
I was very fascinated by how they are interconnected in a very funny way because obviously it's through space and time and they all sort of, in a fascinating way, bring each other into this traveling business. King brings in Queen and like so on and so forth. And you kind of get to see how everything is interlinked in a very real way. You also see a point where all three of them converge in the same place. And then you kind of see other threads, which were kind of, I thought were like vignettes within the novella, actually have relevance. There's a girl who goes missing, and then like she is found again in this particular instance in an unlikely place. Was it an intention of yours to have everything link up that way? You said initially you didn't think that these things would fit together, but did you write the girl, for example, with the thought that she would then come across the others or become a traveler?
Originally not, because that wasn't the original intention. But then as I was writing it occurred to me that some of the threads were already connected. And it was actually a serendipitous thing that this girl found her own story, and entered the weave, as it were. I didn't know that was going to happen. I did have the impulse to weave the story in that direction so that things would link up, although not neatly, because things are never neat in real life also. But I didn't necessarily know how that was going to happen until I was writing the second to last piece of the novella. And then again, the novella originally, the first draft ended there. And then I was left with this feeling of dissatisfaction. And so I knew that there had to be an epilogue and that King had to come back in that and hint at other possibilities. Like I said, writing is a very mysterious process.
Oh, it sounds like it. I also noticed something that tied these three stories together. There's a sense of identity being woven through these stories. Everyone in them is sort of searching for themselves, and they're all very different characters, but there is a sense of searching for self and for community and how that ties in with the world around us. Is that something you like to explore in your stories? I think in your work, characters are as vivid as the landscapes.
It sounds like a cliche, but it's probably not untrue that we all are on the search for ourselves in a sense. And unfortunately, politically, people put two things, create this false dichotomy between the individual and society, or the individual and community. Whereas I see it as we as individuals are shaped not only by, our innate, whatever you call it, genetic heritage and so on, but also by our community and society. And community and society in turn are shaped by the individuals within them. And so the notion of an individual is really a contextual one, right? Because sometimes in certain circumstances, your individual rights and so on are extremely important. In other circumstances, it's more important to be doing some work together with people, as a community, where your identity might expand to enfold and embrace those of others around you, for example. And this is also part of our tradition, if you think about it, that in Buddhism and Hinduism, the notion of neti, the notion of denial of identity in order to expand the possibility of who you are. You also have it in the Sufi tradition when people like Bulleh Shah or Rumi, they say, I'm not this. The notion of individual identity is important, but it's very contextual. And that's also why in this little story of the man running from Traveler's Tales at the Ends of the World, our protagonist, one of the protagonists, King, actually feels that he's something else when he's running through the woods. He doesn't have to be a human, a man, a black man, or whatever it is. He's just a living being out there for the pleasure and joy of running through the woods. And so if our identities are fluid and contextual, why do we hold on to them so rigidly? They make no sense, in certain contexts. We should be able to shift and flow with the context. And that gives you a lot more, it's a far more generous view of identity.
One last question. Obviously, all these stories are linked by climate change. And that's a very important facet of your work in general. And maybe it's a silly question, but can you tell us a bit about why you consider climate fiction so essential as a writer?
Firstly, climate change is the single greatest challenge that humankind faces. But I say that with qualifiers because it is intimately related with other crises. that are social and environmental and intimately related with an extremely unfair, death-worshipping socioeconomic system. I was always interested in environmental matters and particularly how people, certain groups of people, including many groups in India, have managed to coexist with the environment without destroying it. When I first heard about and realized this was a really serious crisis, it occurred to me that as a person who cares about the world, who cares about humans and non-humans, I just had to do what I could. And so I did that in two ways. One was to start writing about climate change in my stories, and the other was to introduce it into my teaching in every course that I taught, and to develop, and through that I've developed a transdisciplinary pedagogy of climate change. And one of the great things about speculative fiction is that you can ask the question, what if? And that can typically take, and I'm oversimplifying here, but it can take roughly two routes. One is you can extrapolate from a current trend and say, what if this kept getting worse and worse and worse? What would happen? And that's your dystopic fiction. And much, much harder than dystopic fiction is to imagine that, okay, all this is happening. We have to admit the reality of it. We have to admit we are in a bad place and likely going to a worse place. But what could you do despite that to create, possibilities of better futures, given that we've destroyed the best future we could have, So, and I think that because speculative fiction, science, whether it takes the form of science fiction like Three World Cantata or more fantastical like Traveler's Tales from the Ends of the World, the thing that speculative fiction does is to put flesh on the bones of the imagination and imagine other possibilities than the ones we are in. The kind of speculative fiction I write, which is, for some people, is dystopic, but that's because they haven't absorbed the reality of the crisis we are in. But to me, it's not dystopic. It's like I'm trying to find ways in which people not only stay alive, but thrive in the midst of crisis and take the reins in their hands to change things. My hope is that by immersing ourselves in worlds that we couldn't otherwise imagine through fiction, we can actually expand our imaginations, because the climate problem is, in a large part, at its core, a problem of the imagination. It's very hard to think about an alternative arrangement of a city or of transportation or of energy and so on and so forth. That's different from what we're used to. And so that's why we're caught in an imagination trap, where our conceptions of the future are simply extrapolations of the present, maybe with a few bells on. Although I don't think climate fiction by itself can change the world, it can at least contribute to an expansion of the imagination.
Thank you. That's a lovely, thoughtful answer. Before we sign off properly, I also wanted to ask if there's any work you'd like to shout out, and so that, our listeners know that they can look out for if something's coming out soon.
Well, there's nothing imminent fiction-wise. I'm working on some short fiction for a couple of anthologies, but I just want to mention that the 3 stories that you mentioned are available on the internet free. And also, if it's of interest for anyone who is interested in the communication and teaching of climate change and our global crises, then I also have my nonfiction book out, which is actually about the role of stories, among other things, in teaching even the science of climate change. And I use mostly stories from real life from marginalized communities. So if that's of interest to anybody, then they might be interested in this book, Teaching Climate Change. But other than that, I should mention only this, that I have 2 novels in my head and hope that in the next 2 years, there will be at least one of them out. I haven't written a novel yet.
Oh, I look forward to that. And I really hope that in the next couple of years, I'll see a novel from you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time and for being on Arcx, Vandana. I'm so thrilled that I got the chance to talk to you and to discuss all of this.
Oh gosh, thank you. I loved the questions, and sorry if my answers were a little long-winded, because that's the danger of the professorial job.
If there's ever a time to be long-winded, it's on a podcast. We are pro long-winded answers.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. You can follow Vandana on X at SinghVan. For clarity, I'll spell that out. SinghVan. Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.